One of the points I come back to a lot on this channel is that the nature of video games and how we experience them are massively influenced by games being interactive media. That the storytelling techniques of a book or a TV show or a movie won't directly translate to video games because the audience's agency forces a storyteller to make changes in how they tell their story, and that the ways that we construct competitions are going to be different in virtual environments compared to their physical counterparts. However, it's not like video games are the only types of interactive media that exist in the world. Board games like Clue or Monopoly are interactive, casual, competitive media with only the thinnest veneer of narrative sometimes on top of them, similar to plenty of video games over the years. On the flip side, you have tabletop RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons where the story takes center stage and many gameplay mechanics like formalized experience systems or spellcasting requirements can be fudged in favor of what actually suits the campaign. What makes video games unique then is that they're obviously governed by a computer. And one of the interesting consequences of that is that we're experiencing a really unique language barrier that we can't really find anywhere else. When we're playing games, we have to learn how to interpret how computers think and speak, to find a way to align human thought processes with that of the computer in order to make sense of why things are happening the way they are, and what the computer is trying to tell us. However, I don't think we really grapple with the reality of what that actually means for us very often, especially for those of us who play a ton of games. The discussion around how do video games influence how we think is often done to discuss their relationship to real-world violence, and is often cynically deployed by American lobbyists for gun manufacturers in particular to explain why the latest mass shooting is because of the shooter playing video games, so who needs gun control reform? This makes a lot of us, understandably, pretty hostile to these sorts of discussions, because it largely feels like a way to present our hobbies in bad faith as a scapegoat, and paint people with a pretty broad brush. Personally, I just find that angle of attack boring. We know violent video games do not cause violence because, in spite of the best interests of those lobbying organizations, there's been no meaningful peer-reviewed replicable studies that have proven a link between the two. I think the far more interesting angle to explore is how our long-term interactions with computers themselves change how we think about things, about what it means to internalize how computers communicate with us, and how we learn from them about how best to interact with them. So, that's what we're going to do today, starting with Part 1. We're only human after all. To kick this off, we have to establish that human communication is inherently imperfect because language itself is inherently imperfect. And that in turn is because every word encompasses multitudes, so perfectly exact communication is almost always impossible. Okay, I'm going to say a sentence to you, and I want you to picture what comes to mind. The big tree fell in the busy street. Your brain is immediately going to start processing the nouns, tree and street, and connecting them to the adjectives, big and busy, to try and give you the closest possible image of what it thinks that could be. Even if you can't visualize like a full picture of this, you still have a concept in mind, right? Well, here's the picture I was describing. Odds are a bunch of details in your mind were wrong. I didn't tell you the type of tree, but your brain has a default concept of a tree that it can fall back on that's likely informed by things like the climate you grew up in. Where I live up north, it's a lot colder, and so a lot of the bigger trees are coniferous trees. However, if you live a bit further south, you might think of a regular deciduous tree, or maybe even something more specifically local like a palm tree. If you know where I'm from, you might try and correct for that, but even if you do, it probably won't be exact. Same goes with big. What constitutes a big tree? Like, are we talking about a redwood or something? We can do the same thing with busy street. Someone from a country that drives on the left would envision a street with cars facing the opposite direction than what I would think. And someone from a wealthy place likely imagines more expensive cars when they think of a busy road. And the image of busy is going to be very different depending on context. Am I talking about busy for a small town? Busy for a major city? And how chaotic are the streets in general? Countries like Canada drive very differently from countries like Italy or India, and our roads are a lot straighter and more car-friendly than those in countries like the UK. The point of all of this is to establish a fundamental principle of linguistic communication. It is imperfect. No matter how hard I tried to describe the picture to you, no matter how many more details I might provide, we could get close, but we'd never get it exact. Add to that the fact that human memories are flawed and easily manipulated. Maybe at some point in the day I saw a picture of a different tree that had fallen on a different road and got the two images mixed up. Or maybe it's been a long time since it happened and my memory's foggy. Or maybe you asked a question about the scene that I didn't have an immediate answer for and my brain tried to fill in some blanks. Even if I remember the broad strokes correctly though, it's not like I can remember how many leaves were on the tree or the model of every car. Human communication is always going to have those gaps, but the advantage we have is that we can extrapolate, explain, and ask for more information. You know that I didn't say that anyone was hurt or died, so you can extrapolate that if I didn't mention something that's that important, it probably didn't happen. You might notice that I said the big tree and the busy street instead of saying a big tree or a busy street, so maybe you interpret that to mean I'm referring to some specific tree and street rather than generic ones. I could explain the number of lanes that the tree crossed, which provides context for both the size of the tree and the road. And if you want to know if this was a busy highway or a busy city street, you could just ask. More importantly though, we both know that this is imperfect. When I say the big tree fell in the busy street, I know that that doesn't fully communicate every single detail, and you know that your image of what I'm saying shouldn't be set in stone. This is one of the big differences between humans and computers. Years and years of social interactions have taught us what we can and can't assume to know from what we're told, and how to work around imperfect language to still communicate effectively. On the flip side, we have non-interactive media like books, movies, and TV shows. They face the same limitations, but they don't have the same capacity for compensation. You can't ask the book to give you more details, you can't necessarily extrapolate details that weren't shown on the TV show, and the movie can't stop and say, "Hey, you seem a little confused, let me explain." This is a big part of what makes human storytelling such a difficult skill to master, and a big part of why generative AI struggles with it actually. As a human writer, I know that this script will eventually become a video for public consumption, so I try to proactively address those issues. I'll plan to show things on screen to explain what I'm saying, or I'll read through the script and think, what questions would I have if I was a new viewer to my channel watching this video, and try to preemptively answer them. Then I have to put trust in you, the audience, to understand where I was going and what I was doing, and in turn you have to trust that I'm not leaving important details out. This is incidentally a major factor in why so many video essayist videos get so long over time, mine included. You learn defensive writing as a result of having to fight for your life in the comments over the years, and you get a grasp for what questions you can answer in advance to avoid having to answer them a million times after the fact. An AI can't operate in that context. It might be able to steal all my scripts and read all your comments, but at the end of the day, that doesn't mean it knows what questions you might ask about this video and this script. It only knows how you respond to things that have already happened here, and while I can extrapolate as a human based on my nearly 27 years on this earth as to what you might say about any given argument I make, the AI doesn't have those 27 years of social interactions to inform its perspective. It also doesn't necessarily know what you want from me, or what you want in general, only what you've previously enjoyed. The YouTube Studio backend has a section where it offers AI-generated video ideas to creators for some unknowable reason, and this is what it offered me a while back. Namely, just rehashes of 5 of my most popular videos, which I don't actually think would do well, because why would you guys want 2 of the same video for me to begin with? Like, 1 inescapable video was enough. I don't think any of us need to do that again. The AI doesn't understand that though. It doesn't understand the reason why you watch that video, why you wouldn't want to watch another one, and why that video did well in the first place. Like, those are more complicated. However, video games are unique because they kind of get the worst of both worlds on this front. They have the inflexibility of a book, but still expect you to interact with them, and they experience the imperfectness of language while also being incapable of moving to meet you. A video game is programmed to accept a pre-established input, not just whatever you want to say to it. If you've ever tried to get customer support from one of those chatbots that show up on every company's website because they'd rather provide subpar customer experiences than pay for actual human support agents, you know the feeling. You have to say the exact right things to get the outcome you'd want in a way that you'd never need to with a human. The game is a static entity in the sense that it is incapable of doing something it isn't already able to do, but it also doesn't necessarily explain to you what it's able to do. Instead, you have to try and meet it where it's at. You have to learn its language, and not just the literal programming language. Part 2. It's not just ones and zeros. When I'm talking about communicating with a game, I'm not just talking about literally talking to it. Communication via language is a big part of communication, but not all communication is literally speaking or writing in an alphabet and language. Body language is a big part of communication, especially for sign languages. Tones are also a huge part of how we communicate, especially in tonal languages like Chinese. Nonverbal communication like your expression is also important, as seen in the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion. In case you haven't noticed, and in case you haven't heard, I happen to be a VTuber, and I actually rigged my own model. That meant that I had to find a way to get it to replicate my expressions accurately as much as possible. Success may vary on that front, so that if I smile, or roll my eyes, or even just look away because I don't want to see something on the screen, then that's still communicated to you. Those sorts of expressions and reactions and whatever else are still part of how I do this, and it's part of why I started VTubing in the first place. I didn't want to have to use my real face, but it's hard to communicate fully without those sorts of nonverbal cues, so this was a happy medium. One day I'll get a model that's actually properly rigged so that it can communicate that better. The reason this matters is that it establishes one of the big weaknesses of computer programming. Namely, that it can't do any of that, at least not independently. And we've gotten really used to operating on a computer's terms in a lot of our daily lives, so we don't necessarily notice how limiting it is. If your car's check engine light flashes, you probably need a device that can scan the car's computer to check and see what error code it gives you. In the past, there was an assumption that a human being would not only need to fix the problem, but also diagnose it themselves. So the car would have been built in such a way that it would be easy to both diagnose and fix for the average person, or at least the average mechanic. Relying on the computer for diagnostics means that cars aren't going to be built in the same way anymore, which in turn limits our ability to maintain our own vehicles and gives a lot more power to the manufacturers. Alternatively, you could consider banking. In the old days, if you wanted a loan from your bank, you just had to go in there and talk to a person, and they'd make the call based on whatever documents you could bring them, whatever documents they might have, and whatever they might know about you personally. Today, that's not really possible. Banks aren't nearly as flexible on that front, and there's a lot of digitally based policies for things like authentication and risk management and money laundering prevention and stuff. The bank can check every single transaction on your account and see if there's a suspicious pattern, or compile all your financial information from every institution to see what your deal is. We're used to this stuff in a million small ways. Character limits and auto moderation on social media platforms, digital payment systems and mobile deposits for our banking, identity verification and digital signatures for important information. And all of those are dictated by that digital inflexibility. And yet we accommodate it and adjust. As humans, our adaptability is one of our strongest attributes, and that means that we're a good fit for this sort of thing. That doesn't mean everyone can adapt though. And like many technological revolutions of the past, computers are extremely unforgiving to the inexperienced. The most obvious example is elderly people who are often unable to access online services, which is a real problem as everything about our lives becomes more online. For those of us who can't adapt to how the computer communicates with us and can't learn to understand how the computer thinks, there's a real risk of being left behind. And of being left vulnerable to people who know how to take advantage of their inability to understand how this stuff works. Think about how many people have gotten hit with viruses because they clicked on a button to download more RAM to make their computer run faster. Or who've been scammed because someone phoned them to say that the bank made an error and was going to e-transfer them money and just needed their account information to send it through. And for our purposes, video games requiring such a rigid adherence to their own boutique languages makes them really inaccessible for people who aren't already familiar with them. Especially because you're not really talking to the computer directly. Part 3. Translating and interpreting. When it comes to video games, there's a really interesting dynamic to this because the computer is interactive, but not really a participant. It's really more reactive than interactive, having been given a billion rules to follow and processes to execute if conditions are met, but no autonomy in terms of actually interacting with you. This is complicated by the fact that the video game isn't communicating what it's literally thinking to you, only a representation of what it's doing. You're responsible for the inputs and the computer tells you its output, but it doesn't necessarily tell you why that was the output for that input. When you press W, the computer interprets that, looks through its programming to see what W should do, and then shows you what it's supposed to do. If you're meant to walk forward, then you're walking forward. This sounds simple, but it's part of what makes the game so hard to learn for new people. If you were playing a board game and wanted to move your piece forwards, you just move it forward. It's literal communication. There is a direct relationship between what you want to do, what you do, and what the outcome is. Video games as digital media require the computer to serve as an interpreter and translator for you as well as your conversation partner. But again, only in a reactive way. Video games can't be proactive outside of what they're programmed to be. They can't teach you how to play them or tell you the controls unless they've been programmed to offer you tutorials or programmed to show you the button mapping. But even then, it's only once you've given it the necessary inputs to make it do that, like walking up to a certain area where the game is set to initiate a tutorial. Again, this is what I'm talking about when I say that video games present a unique language barrier unlike anything else we've ever experienced. Computers require precise inputs in a way that humans just don't, and they are really inflexible about it. A computer can't extrapolate about your intent or what you're trying to tell it. If you're playing a fighting game and you're trying to pull off a combo but you move the joystick or thumbstick a little too far in the wrong direction, the game can't say, okay, I clearly understand what you're trying to do, I've got you, we'll still do it, the way that a human being could. Or even just, hey, so here's why that didn't work. You need to move the joystick a little bit more in this direction. It can only tell you what it's been programmed to tell you, and if you don't speak its language, it can't reply to you. This becomes especially frustrating the closer the action you're attempting to do feels very simple. Walking forward and looking around are some of the most simple natural actions that any of us can think of, which makes it feel like it should be very easy to do in video games. And on mouse and keyboard, it's relatively intuitive. Especially because those are pieces of hardware that we regularly use outside of video games as well, so people feel more comfortable with them. But controllers are where we can really see that language barrier in full effect. This section was titled Translating and Interpreting, because that's basically what both parties are doing here. You want to do something in the game, so you use a controller or a keyboard as a digital interpreter to provide the computer with an input in a format that it can process. And the computer checks that input against its own internal human-to-computer dictionary the same way that you might look up a French word in a French-English dictionary to try and understand it. Once the computer finds the definition of that input, it checks to see how it's meant to respond to that input, and that becomes the output it provides to you. But once again, it's processed through an interpreter, like a monitor or a speaker, so that you can understand it. Maybe the French thing that was said to you was ça va, and once you looked that up in your French-English dictionary, you found out that it meant how's it going? So you went and looked up the word for good, which is bien, so you say bien. And then to be polite, you ask them ça va in return. This is basically what's happening when you're interacting with a computer, but with the added wrinkle that you're never given access to the dictionary yourself. Only the computer has that, and it's written in a way that only the computer can understand. If you're lucky, the developers will have added some translations for you. Games like Marvel Rivals and Overwatch will tell you which buttons will activate which abilities, for example, meaning that you can learn some of the game's language to bridge the gap. However, again, the computer can't do nuance. In that same conversation from before, the French speaker might help you out and let you know that you technically were correct, but that it would sound a bit more natural to say something like, bien, et vous? Which is, well, and yourself? Instead of just saying, good, how are you? They might also correct your pronunciation. Maybe you tried to say it the way they suggested but said vous more like vous, and they can help you with that. Those French-English dictionaries can't really tell you how people talk, only what words translate to. In the same way, a video game's internal translations can only really tell it that the left mouse button equals primary fire, but not what the right way to fire it is or how to do it better. Any translations that the developers of the game provide are often similarly limited, meaning that you and the computer are ultimately having a pretty rudimentary conversation where you don't necessarily understand the full implications of what you're telling it. Details like fall off or spread or damage on that primary fire are things that the computer knows and automatically applies when you press left click, but it doesn't necessarily tell you them. The French speaker can tell you, hey, I get what you're saying, but in the future, this would be the better way to say that. But the computer can't tell you, hey, I see that you're trying to shoot at that target, but just as a heads up, they're too far away and there's actually a 50% damage fall off at that range, unless the developers add that to your computer to human dictionary somewhere. This then puts the onus exclusively on us as the humans here to meet the computer where it's at. We have to learn how to think like a computer. The computer isn't meant to learn how to think like a person. This is something you'll really notice if you're playing a game against a CPU opponent, because they're speaking the same language as the computer, and they don't need to worry about anything getting lost in translation or needing to be interpreted through a controller. The CPUs can just tell the game what they want to do, and they're basically perfect at it. At least, in theory. Developers will often implement deliberate flaws into CPU opponents to make sure that they're beatable for a person. Stuff like giving them deliberately worse accuracy to mimic human aim percentages, or forcing them to clearly telegraph a move to compensate for human reaction speeds. Or even just to act randomly like in Generation 4 Pokemon games where the trainers were just programmed to pick one of 4 moves at random. However, if you're like me, you might not have had many friends as a kid, so you might have played most of these games almost exclusively against the computer. And that brings me to one of the biggest examples of how video games force us to think differently. Part 4. Following the rules. As a kid, I didn't really play a ton of games, but the two that I put the most hours into were Quantum Redshift and Fusion Frenzy. Both games I've actually made videos about in the past if you're interested. Both of these games were able to be played against human opponents, but I didn't really have many people who wanted to play them with me, so I mostly just got good at beating the CPU. Which meant that I had to feel my way around the game to learn how to speak its language. For a clear example, let's look at Quantum Redshift. It's a hover car racing game where you pick up power-ups to load weapons to fire at opponents as well as shields you can use to protect yourself. If you deal enough damage to an opponent, they're killed and eliminated from the race, so taking down your opponents is a pretty viable strategy. However, let's say that you're, 5 or 6-year-old me, and you realize that trying to treat the CPUs like they're people isn't really working out, so you start paying attention to how the AI plays. And you start to learn a few things. First, you learn that once the AI racers hit a certain level of health, they'll immediately deploy whatever shields they have to protect themselves, and they'll keep instantly activating that power-up whenever they pick it up until it's recharged their health to a sufficient level. You'll also learn that the AI can't power up past level 2 abilities at most difficulties, which means that if you hit them with a lot of damage from a lot of attacks all at once, they'll often deploy the level 2 shield midway through the attack, which has the unique effect of causing all incoming damage to be converted into health. You'll also learn that the AI will never deploy shields defensively when they hear a warning about an incoming attack. They only deploy them if they're low health. This means that if you're playing a character who deals in single target damage almost exclusively, you are at a distinct advantage against the CPUs compared to a character who deals with multi-target damage. Tara Vivas' ultimate is a single-shot nuke that can instantly kill an opponent from near full health at most difficulties, and the opponent won't even try to shield unless they're already nearly dead. If you're her nemesis Alicia Waverly though, the AI will take just enough damage to fall under that threshold, then it'll deploy that shield, then it'll probably get fully healed off the remainder of your ultimate. On the flip side, the AI will never fire at you if you've got a shield active, but it can tell at any range if you do have that shield up, which means that every time you activate your shield, you need to make sure you can get to another shield power up fast to make sure you're not vulnerable. And then, if you play the game a little bit longer, you'll realize that there is a notable exception to this: your nemesis. Your nemesis fucking hates you personally, and if they charge up their ultimate, they will almost exclusively use it on you. And if they have it charged and you pass into their line of sight at any time, they'll instantly fire it on you. However, as a result, if your nemesis has charged up their ultimate ability, they'll refuse to shield themselves almost no matter what if you stay out of that line of sight because of how the game handles ultimates. You charge an ult in Quantum Redshift by picking up 3 of each type of power-up, and then picking up 1 more of any type. And once it's charged, you can't use any of your regular abilities, only the ultimate. The ultimate will deploy an attack as well as a tier 3 shield, which reflects incoming damage back at whoever fired it. But again, once it's charged, you can't use any of that until you burn the full ult. If you notice your nemesis isn't shooting at people anymore or isn't shielding at low health, you can probably assume that it's because they've charged that ability and they're waiting to fire it at you. Importantly, none of this is how a human being would play the game. Humans will shield defensively, they'll use their weapons on whoever's best to use them on, and they can't react instantly. A human player might even deliberately burn a power up to avoid charging their ultimate in order to keep themselves freed up to use their shields, or might burn their shields to make sure they're only charged up to a level 2 to make sure they can heal up off of incoming damage. But when you're playing against the AI, you can learn how to speak its language and beat it at its own game. I learned how to manipulate the AI to work in my favor, but in the process I also changed how I think when I'm playing in a way that wouldn't make sense against a human opponent. All of this is possible because computers are very good at being very particular. And while this video has often emphasized how that's an obstacle, it's not inherently a bad thing. AI opponents often expose how the game interprets itself and its rules, which in turn can teach us how to play it better than playing against a human who won't be playing with such a rigid adherence to the limits and expectations of the programming, which makes it harder to figure them out if you're just looking at that side of things. In the real world, there are often instances where hyper-particular language is very important, particularly when it comes to law. Legal jargon is often hard to parse for the average person because it takes our everyday language and applies new specific meanings to words to try and eliminate the inherent flaws of language being nuanced and vague so there's no room for misinterpretation. In a way, legal language is probably the closest parallel human-to-human communication has to human-to-computer communication. However, even at our most rules-based, we can't hold a candle to how computers react to rules. They'll follow them to the letter because they have no choice. They're not built to try and find exploits or to try to do something weird, and if they weren't built for it, they can't do it. The challenge that comes with this then is that only one party has the full unabridged rulebook to the game, and it just so happens that it's the party that's least capable of communicating proactively with you. In a game of Overwatch, none of those 10 people has access to Overwatch's rulebook. Same goes for the 12 people in a Rivals game, or the 4 people in a Mario Party game, or a Fusion Frenzy game, or any other human players in any other game. That doesn't just affect the players either. This is also a real challenge for developers who need to make sure that they give the computer a perfect rulebook if they want it to work right. If there's a typo in the rules to a board game, the human players can just work around it. But if there's a semicolon in the wrong place in a game's programming, it can break everything and the computer might not even be able to tell you where it happened. Like, a computer doesn't know something is wrong unless it's been told to interpret that thing as wrong, which is, incidentally, what makes stuff like combating hackers so difficult. A video game doesn't inherently know that aimbotting is bad. It has to be taught that it is and how to recognize it. And a big part of what goes into developing cheats is finding ways to convince the computer that the conditions for something it recognizes as bad aren't actually being met. By contrast, it's often a lot easier for a human being to identify a cheater in a lot of circumstances. Setting aside the people who accuse everyone who hits a lucky shot of being an aimbotter anyways. A human being can see the difference between someone who's just holding their crosshair at the optimal position and someone who clearly has it locked onto someone who hasn't popped out from behind the wall yet. We can identify when someone's positioning doesn't make any sense unless they know for a fact that the enemy team is positioned somewhere else. Those sorts of things are hard to teach the computer because they're fundamentally human behaviors that don't line up neatly with the kind of logic computers have to follow, which can make them hard for these systems to catch. That's part of why anti-cheats are often intensely focused on basically getting knuckle deep in your computer to try and understand what sorts of software you're running. It might not be able to identify the behavior, but it can try and identify the cheat at the software level. For both developers and players, we're at the whims of how computers are able to think and communicate with us, and that means we ultimately have to adjust our thinking to try and align with the computers. And it's not like people haven't tried to change this, or adjust for it, or try to make their games account for as much as possible. And maybe the most notable example of this is with the current generative AI trend that's going on. Some people think that AI is going to change how we play games by allowing for infinite content, more reactive worlds, or more dynamic interactions than PCs. But every time I see someone trying to offer an example of this, it just reinforces why that won't work. Part 5. What it means to think like a computer. There are a few reasons why I think we've seen the push for more generative AI in gaming, but the two biggest ones tend to revolve around companies wanting to get rid of workers in favor of a cheaper alternative, and the desire of some gamers to see quote-unquote better storytelling in games. These might feel like unrelated motivations, but they spin out from the same shared starting points. The biggest is that this is a result of a concentrated effort over the years to devalue creative work. The idea that being a writer or an actor or an artist or a musician isn't a real job with real value to society, and that these people don't deserve to get paid that much just to do something that's fun. This is a view that we can see pop up in response basically whenever somebody who's working in a creative field demands better, whether that's the WGA demanding better pay and working conditions or Chapel Roan arguing for health insurance and better rights for musicians. Another big one, frankly, is people not being very well educated when it comes to media, and there's a lot of people who legitimately just don't know good from bad. A lot of people genuinely cannot tell the difference between generic AI-generated slop content that says nothing, means nothing, and goes nowhere versus something written by a person with a legitimate point of view, lived experiences, and a point that they're trying to make, because they have never learned how to actually develop an understanding of this stuff and do not think they should have to learn. The former point is an age-old cynical tool deployed by corporate overlords to turn the working class against one another, to paint the people who create the media you love and the culture you exist within as greedy and entitled for wanting to be able to maybe buy a house for themselves at some point, rather than having to fork over all their money to a billionaire CEO who will only hoard the cash, which keeps it out of circulation and long-term actually hurts the economy. You'll see workers pick this up and use it to attack one another constantly because it does strike at something true, namely that most workers under capitalism are treated poorly. Teachers in America are paid dogshit wages, and it is unacceptable. And it feels unfair that they get paid worse than so many people in seemingly non-essential or just less important jobs. But the problem ultimately isn't that people like Hollywood writers might get paid more than them. The problem is that their governments are implementing austerity policies and cutting public education in order to privilege for-profit charter and private schools, as well as to lower the general standard of education for the average person in the United States to make the population dumb and compliant. And then they turn the workers against each other so that they don't turn on them. They know that you're mad that you're stuck holding shit together by just a single thread, and they know that they're the reason why. So they redirect your anger towards the people who've managed to claw back 2 or 3 more threads than you instead of the ones who are hoarding them all. However, the second point, the one about how people don't know good from bad, is the one I think is more relevant to our specific discussion here. See, games have forced us to change how we think when we play them over the years, in the same way that computers change how we think about everything else that we use them for. That's what technology does. It changes how we think, especially in terms of communication. I talked about this a bunch in my video, The Myth of the Overwatch Killer, but a much simpler example for our purposes is the 1979 song Video Killed the Radio Star. A song that you've probably heard of but maybe haven't listened to fully, where the narrator is singing about his nostalgia for a radio star he listened to when he was younger, whose career was presumably killed by the invention and proliferation of television. Video killed the radio star because suddenly there were new things you had to do as a musician, and not everyone could do them. Artists like Madonna or Michael Jackson, born 13 days apart in August of 1958, grew up in the dawn of the age of the video star and then became its standard bearers in terms of turning music into a full spectacle. Their videos were what killed the radio stars. Years later, the internet would do this multiple times. The rise of the concept of a viral trend allowed for Gangnam Style, for Harlem Shake, and more songs like them to take off. Streaming platforms like Spotify and Apple Music forever changed how we consume music by effectively killing what it once meant to put out an album. And then now we've got TikTok once again killing the past. Old artists who can't make a TikTok hit or who can't turn one of their songs into a viral sound are going to be passed over in favor of the new stars who know how to use the internet to get them onto the main stage in a way they probably couldn't have in a past era. This isn't an inherently bad thing, though. Every generation bemoans the death of their own radio stars killed by their own video, but that doesn't mean that video doesn't give us good things. Someone like Madonna kind of needed video to become a star because, realistically, she's a lot of style, even if she doesn't necessarily always have as much substance. It was about this whole aesthetic, about this whole presentation. That was what made her a star. And without video, that might not have been possible. In the more modern era, Lady Gaga probably wouldn't have reached the heights that she did if not for YouTube, which was invented just a couple years before she came onto the scene, and her videos played a big part in her popularity. And more recently, Doechii might not have ever gotten her foot in the door if it wasn't for TikTok. All of this brings us back to the original topic, namely how games force us to think differently. Again, it's an inevitability that we will adapt and adjust technology to accommodate it. Think about how, at one point in time, cars just weren't a thing. Then, once they were invented and popularized and became the standard, we formalized rules for both pedestrians and cars and learned how to exist around them. Same goes for computers. We survived before them, and we've changed how we think and act to accommodate the things they allow us to do now. However, where this becomes a problem is when we come to view this as the natural way of things, to view the car-centric city as the natural formation of a city, or to view a computer-centric ludonarrative medium of video games as the natural way to contextualize both gameplay and narrative. The reason this is a problem is because these aren't natural things, and the restrictions and limitations of them need to be recognized for what they are and where they come from, rather than accepted and wholesale incorporated into our own ways of thinking, replacing what the human brain and body are actually built for and capable of. Part 6. Computers don't know what you want. Cars dominate cities because they're fast and comfortable ways to get wherever you need to go. They're also very profitable for a lot of people, both directly and indirectly. They're profitable for manufacturers of cars and parts, for producers of essential consumable components like fuel and oil, and for businesses that rely on you being able to walk out of their store with 50 pounds worth of goods that you can safely transport 10 kilometers back to your home in the dead of winter without worrying about freezing to death or getting robbed. Computers, likewise, dominate society because they're undeniably good at so many things. They're better record keepers than us, they're better rule followers than us, and they can be everywhere all at once. However, both are still flawed technologies. Cars are very dangerous. They're vulnerable to a billion points of failure, both in terms of the internal components as well as the human flaws of every single driver on the road. They're very expensive, both to buy and to operate, and they don't hold their value, and so much more. When a city becomes totally reliant on cars at the expense of walkability and public transit, there are genuine problems for a lot of people that can make things worse. For people who can't drive safely, like the very young, the elderly, or those with medical conditions or disabilities that impair their ability to drive, this sort of thing is genuinely dangerous. And not just for them. A lot of elderly people continue driving even when they shouldn't because there's no other way for them to get to doctor's appointments or get groceries or get medication when they need it, which puts all of us on the road at risk. Cars also create a lot of wear and tear on infrastructure that's expensive to maintain, and during winter months it costs a lot of money to clear and salt the roads in order to make sure you don't hit some black ice and go careening through a third-grade field trip as they cross the road. That's not to say that cars are fundamentally bad and that nobody should ever be able to drive them. I live in a rural area. There are places where, just objectively speaking, public transit isn't really an option. Some people are going to need to have cars in order to get into town. But what I am saying is that no one technology is the solution to every problem, and that remembering the shortfalls of any given technology is essential for making sure we don't overlook the risks of an over-reliance on it. When it comes to video games and computers, one of the big issues is that this has become one of the most dominant forms of media over the last few years. And for some people, this is the only type of mass media they regularly consume. They don't watch movies, read books, listen to the radio, or watch television. It's just video games. And for those people, I think they've gotten to a point where they've internalized the idea that the way computers think is how we think. They've normalized the idea that these sorts of limitations on gameplay and narrative in games are something that naturally exists because of a shared limitation between humans and computers, not one that computers are imposing on us, and so see generative AI as a way to solve the problem by allowing the computer to overcome a human weakness. The epitome of this can be seen in how people think about self-driving cars, which exists at the intersection of car-centric and computer-centric thinking. When you think that the flaws of cars are shared flaws with humans, and the flaws of computers are shared flaws with humans, you think of self-driving cars only in terms of what they do better than those supposedly intrinsic flaws humans have on both counts. You start to look at both cars and computers in terms of what they can do better than that baseline, not in terms of how they themselves create a ceiling for the humans. When you don't view any alternative to cars as viable, whether that's walkable cities, public transit, or whatever else, you view self-driving cars purely in the context of how they compete with human-driven ones. When you don't view any alternative to computers as viable for narrative or gameplay development because you view game developers and writers, the humans involved, as either incompetent or DEI or woke, whatever other bullshit people are saying now, you view generative AI only in terms of how it competes with what you see as a flaw that humans and computers otherwise share that only computers have the capacity to improve on. The problem with this in the context of video games is that the computer doesn't know what humans want. It fundamentally can't. It doesn't understand the idea of wanting, only what it is and is not supposed to do. It can only know what it's been told to know, and that still holds true for generative AI. Gen AI can only replicate what's already been created. It can only take from what it has learned, but it doesn't know why those things were created or what purpose it serves to be created in that way. It doesn't know who created them or what informed their decisions to create them or their intentions in creating them in the first place. It just knows that the things exist and that they line up with certain keywords, so it'll string them together to try and make something that meets a brief. However, that doesn't erase that it's still a computer-specific form of thinking, one that is incapable of creativity, of innovation, or even just of thinking for itself. It can give the illusion of creativity or of innovation or of thinking for itself if you have internalized how computers think as being just how thought happens. But that's not true. On a very basic level, the AI still needs a human to give it direction and tell it what to do. It cannot do anything autonomously of its own free will and creative desires because it has neither of those things, and both of them are essential for games to actually be good. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean computers are bad. Generative AI is a different topic, namely because it is bad. It's just theft. It isn't crediting the people who did the hard work, it's stealing their labor. But that's a topic for another time. Nor does any of this mean that it's bad to learn how to think in terms of how computers think. Modern computers are marvels of engineering that can do things that would have seemed like fucking magic less than a century ago. However, when you fully surrender the human way of thinking in favor of the computer's way of thinking, you lose sight of the things that only humans can do. The things that we are prevented from doing with computers, not because of our own limitations, but because of the limitations of the hardware. You begin to view the failures of games to scratch itches for you as something that must then solely fall on the humans. And you see generative AI as the solution because you think they're capable of something the humans involved aren't. You don't see video games as art, or as competition, or even really as a product. You just see them as video games, without qualifiers or without a concept of the greater context in which they live. You see them as a thing that exists in its own bubble in the universe, rather than as a part of an era-spanning human tradition of communication. You become incapable of recognizing the video game's place in our history of tragedies and comedies, of heroic victories and untold sacrifices. You lose sight of what it means for human beings to compete, of what motivated our ancestors to start chucking discuses around in ancient Greece, or start kicking a ball around a field and formulate rules and procedures for what it means to be the best of the best at that. You forget what it means for human beings to create, to invent musical instruments to create sounds no one's ever heard of before, to invent new art styles that influence generations of artists to follow in their footsteps, to pioneer new techniques that have untold ripple effects on science, art, culture, and humanity at large. You become detached from who you are and what you're experiencing, which is the product of millennia of human successes and human failures in an effort to turn the world into something better for ourselves that we can build for ourselves. Computers didn't bring us here any more than cars did. Humanity brought us here, for better and for worse. It brought us those computers and cars and everything else we use to improve our lives. And it's our responsibility to ensure that we remember that these things are ultimately tools that we built to serve us and the world at large, not things that we were built to capitulate to. We learn how to think the way computers do because we built them to serve us for productivity, efficiency, and entertainment, and so it serves our interests to know how to use them well. But never mistake that for the computer knowing humanity better than humanity itself does. And that's where we're going to wrap this one up. Thank you very much for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you enjoyed this video, you should consider becoming a channel member on YouTube or Patreon. Channel members not only play a big role in supporting the work that I do, but also get to vote for one topic per month, including the topic of the video you just watched. The March Members' Choice poll is going on right now between these 4 topics until the end of the day on March 10th. So if you want to have a say in what comes next, you should definitely consider becoming a member. I'll give you a bit of an explainer of the topics just so you know what you're getting into as well. First, there's The Culling, a cautionary tale about audience input. This video would be about The Culling, an old battle royale game that came out right before the big BR boom and how its obsession with listening to audience feedback ultimately killed it. Next up is Making the Case for Role Queue. This video would be an attempt to make the case for Role Queue, both within the context of Overwatch's implementation of it and Marvel Rivals' decision not to follow suit. For our third topic, we've got Drag Race and the Death of Competition. This video would be about how competitions die competitive deaths, using RuPaul's Drag Race as the case study into how a strong competitive format can be weakened over time. And lastly, there's how Buried Stars gets social media toxicity right. This video would be a return to Buried Stars, focusing specifically on how it portrays social media toxicity through its Twitter stand-in of Fader, and how that toxicity impacts each of the characters differently. Like I said, voting for this ends on March 10th at midnight Mountain Standard Time, so make sure to vote quick. If you're already a channel member on either YouTube or Patreon, you can find the links to vote on your respective platforms in the description. And if you're not but would like to become one, the links for that are also in the description. Lastly, thank you very much to all my channel members. At the $25 Elite membership tier, thank you to Jules Coolness. At the $10 Premium membership tier, thank you to Tortoise and Jatenar and a Ghostbat. At the $5 channel membership tier, thank you to MiniQ, Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Destiny, Yoshi of the Wire, Cadence, Windex the Great, Deleathers, Gavost, Marsh Alice, Crimson Cyclo, Good Guy Luis, Corey, MV, The Only Enigma, Mariah, Amon Dadley, Meep Cubed, Noisy Pitta, Harv, Marcy Gaskill, Junkie McRat, Deku _ Safon, Empress Artemis, and T. Laskin. Whether you're a channel member, a subscriber, or you just clicked on this video out of curiosity, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.